At a wedding, the groom hit the bride's son. What happened next shocked everyone. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're watching this video from. Alyssa had never believed in fairy tales, but she had always believed in love. She had grown up in a warm and supportive home, raised by parents who had taught her the value of strength and independence. Even when life had been difficult, she had managed to carve out a path for herself. As a single mother, she had built a stable and successful career, balancing the demands of motherhood and work with quiet determination. Her son, Noah, was the center of her world, a bright, curious 7-year-old who filled her days with laughter and wonder. She had not been looking for love when she met Daniel. It had been an ordinary evening at a charity event, one she had attended more out of obligation than genuine interest. The room had been filled with the usual crowd of well-dressed socialites, exchanging polite smiles and empty pleasantries. She had been sipping her wine, scanning the room for a friendly face when he had approached her. Daniel was charming in a way that seemed effortless. His suit was perfectly tailored, his smile confident, but not arrogant. His light skin contrasted with the deep brown of her own, but he did not seem to notice. Or, at least, he pretended not to. He had spoken to her as though they were already familiar, as if he had been waiting for the moment their paths would cross. "I almost didn't come tonight," he had admitted with a self-deprecating chuckle, "but now I see that would have been a mistake." Alyssa had smiled, feeling a spark of something she had not felt in a long time. He was attentive, witty, and seemed genuinely interested in her. It was easy to fall into conversation with him. They had spent the evening talking, exchanging stories about their lives, their ambitions. When he had asked about her son, she had braced herself for the usual flicker of hesitation that men often showed when they learned she was a mother. Instead, Daniel had smiled. "I admire that," he had said, his tone warm. "Being a single mother must take incredible strength." Alyssa had felt something shift inside her that night. She had dated before, but few men had made her feel seen the way Daniel did. He was successful, intelligent, and, above all, he seemed to understand her. As their relationship deepened over the following months, Daniel continued to play the role of the perfect man. He showered Alyssa with attention, planned thoughtful dates, and never once made her feel as though she was asking for too much. He was patient with Noah, bringing small gifts and making an effort to engage with him. On paper, he was everything she had ever wanted. But Noah, perceptive beyond his years, had been wary from the start. Her son had always been a quiet observer, studying people with an intuition that often surprised Alyssa. At first, she had thought his hesitance was simply a matter of adjusting to someone new in their lives. But over time, she began to notice small things that were easy to dismiss but impossible to ignore completely. Noah never rushed to Daniel the way he had with others. He never reached for his hand or climbed into his lap the way children sometimes did with adults they trusted. Instead, he stayed close to Alyssa, his small fingers curling tightly around hers when Daniel was near. She had asked him about it once, tucking him into bed after a long day. "Do you like Daniel?" she had asked softly, brushing a curl away from his forehead. Noah had hesitated, his brows drawn together in thought. "He's nice," he had said finally, but there had been something in his voice, something uncertain. Alyssa had smiled, pressing a kiss to his temple. "I think he's nice too." At the time, she had believed that Noah simply needed time to adjust. After all, change could be difficult for a child. But as their relationship continued, she began to notice other, more troubling things. Daniel was never unkind to Noah in an obvious way. He never raised his voice, never made cruel remarks, but there was a distance there, a coldness that Alyssa could not quite place. When they spent time together, Daniel was always polite but detached. He would acknowledge Noah, but only in the way one might acknowledge a coworker's child at a holiday party, distantly, without true interest. More than once, she caught a flicker of something in Daniel's eyes when Noah spoke too loudly or interrupted their conversations. A brief flash of irritation, quickly masked by a smile. It was easy to ignore, at least at first. One evening, they had been at Daniel's apartment for dinner. Alyssa had been in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a salad, when she had heard a sharp intake of breath from the living room. She had turned, peering around the corner. Noah had been sitting on the floor, playing with his toy cars, his face turned slightly downward. Daniel had been standing over him, his posture rigid. Alyssa had frowned. "Everything okay?" Daniel's expression had smoothed instantly, his smile returning as he turned toward her. "Of course," he had said easily. "Noah just spilled his juice. We'll clean it up." It had seemed like nothing at the time, but the image had stayed with her. Later that night, after they had returned home, she had noticed a small, faint bruise on Noah's shoulder. She had asked him about it, but he had simply shrugged. "I don't know," he had said, and she had let it go. Over time, little things continued to pile up. Daniel's patience with Noah seemed to wear thinner the longer they spent together. He began correcting him more often, telling him to sit still, to be quieter, to behave. But it was always subtle. Always just enough that Alyssa could convince herself she was imagining it. She told herself that Daniel was simply not used to children, that he was trying, in his own way, to be a father figure, that he only wanted what was best for them. And then, one day, Daniel had proposed. It had been a beautiful evening. They had been at the restaurant where they had had their first date, a private table set beneath twinkling fairy lights. Daniel had taken her hand, his expression soft and full of adoration. "I love you," he had said, "and I love the life we're building together. I want to spend forever with you." Alyssa had said yes. She had ignored the flicker of doubt that had crept into her mind. She had ignored the way Noah had stayed silent when she told him the news. She had convinced herself that this was the right choice, that Daniel was the right choice. And in that moment, she had believed it. The weeks leading up to the wedding should have been the happiest time of Alyssa's life. She was marrying a man who, by all accounts, was perfect. A man who loved her, who had asked her to be his wife in the most romantic way possible. A man who had promised her forever. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. The preparations consumed her days. There were invitations to send, dresses to be tailored, a venue to finalize. Every waking hour was filled with meetings and choices, and through it all, Daniel was right beside her, smiling, agreeing, making her feel as though they were truly building something together. Yet, the tension beneath the surface only grew. Noah was quieter than usual. He didn't complain, didn't throw tantrums, but he had withdrawn in a way that Alyssa couldn't quite explain. He spent more time in his room, playing alone, reading quietly. He avoided Daniel when possible, though he never outright refused to be in the same room as him. It was subtle, just enough that Alyssa could brush it off as normal childhood behavior. One evening, as she sat on the couch, flipping through pages of wedding magazines, Noah climbed onto the sofa beside her. He tucked himself close to her, resting his head against her arm. "Mom," he said hesitantly, his small fingers playing with the hem of her sleeve. Hmm? Alyssa glanced down at him, brushing a curl from his forehead. Do we have to move in with Daniel? She hesitated, caught off guard. Well, yes, sweetheart. After the wedding, we'll all live together, like a family. Noah was silent for a long time before he murmured, I like it here. Alyssa sighed softly, kissing the top of his head. I know, baby, but it's going to be good for us. Daniel will take care of us. You'll have your own room, your own space. It'll be fun, I promise. Noah nodded, but his expression remained uncertain. She should have asked more. She should have pressed him, should have listened, but she didn't. As the wedding day drew closer, Daniel's mask began to slip. At first, it was small things. A comment here, a glance there. His patience with Noah, which had always seemed carefully measured, grew thinner. He still kept up appearances in front of Alyssa, but when he thought she wasn't looking, his irritation with the boy surfaced more openly. It happened one afternoon at a wedding fitting. Alyssa was being measured for final alterations, standing before a tall mirror, admiring the way the dress hugged her figure. Noah was sitting in the corner of the boutique, quietly playing with his toy car. The car slipped from his hands, skidding across the wooden floor. Daniel, who had been scrolling through his phone, barely looked up. Pick it up. Noah scrambled to grab the toy, but his hands were clumsy and it rolled further away. He scooted forward to reach it, but Daniel's voice cut sharply through the room. I said, pick it up. Noah froze. Alyssa turned sharply, frowning. Daniel, it's just a toy. He's being careless, Daniel replied smoothly, though his eyes remained hard. He needs to learn to be more responsible. Noah hurriedly retrieved the car and sat back down, his small hands gripping it tightly. Alyssa forced a smile and returned to her fitting, but unease settled heavily in her chest. The true test came just a week before the wedding. It was late. Noah was getting ready for bed, brushing his teeth in the bathroom while Alyssa finished some last-minute wedding planning. Daniel was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of whiskey, his posture unusually tense. He's too soft, Daniel said suddenly. Alyssa looked up from her laptop. Who? Your son? A chill ran down her spine. Noah? She asked, frowning. He's a child, Daniel. He's too sensitive, too coddled. Daniel took another sip of whiskey. If he's going to grow up into a man, he needs discipline. Alyssa stiffened. He's 7. He doesn't need discipline. He needs love and patience. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. You don't understand, Alyssa. I know how the world works. You think kindness will prepare him for life, but it won't. He needs to toughen up. She didn't respond immediately. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. I think I'm raising him just fine. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if reeling himself back in. His expression softened, his voice turning gentle again. I just want the best for him, that's all. For both of you. She wanted to believe that, but the look in his eyes was still there, lurking beneath the surface. The night before the wedding, Noah came to her room. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, his small body silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. Mom? Alyssa looked up from packing an overnight bag. What's wrong, baby? Noah hesitated, glancing down at his bare feet. Can I sleep in here with you tonight? Something in her chest clenched. She nodded, opening her arms. Of course. He climbed into bed beside her, curling against her side the way he used to when he was smaller. She ran her fingers through his hair, feeling the slight tremor in his tiny frame. Are you nervous about tomorrow? She asked softly. Noah was quiet for a long moment before he finally whispered, I don't want him to be my dad." Alyssa's heart twisted. She swallowed hard, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "You'll always have me," she said, "no matter what." She wished she had listened to the fear in his voice. She wished she had known that the next day Daniel would show his true face. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The sun bathed the estate in golden light, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured gardens where rows of white chairs had been arranged for the ceremony. The estate itself was grand, belonging to one of Daniel's wealthy relatives, a sprawling property that exuded old money and prestige. Everything had been planned to perfection, from the flower arrangements to the elegant seating charts. It was the kind of wedding that Alyssa had once dreamed of. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, adjusting the delicate lace of her gown. The fabric hugged her figure perfectly, the intricate beading shimmering under the soft light. She should have felt happy, overwhelmed with anticipation for the life she was about to start. Instead, she felt a tightness in her chest that she couldn't quite explain. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Mom?" Noah's small voice carried through the room, and she turned to see him peeking through the doorway, dressed in his tiny black tuxedo. His dark curls were neatly combed, his brown eyes wide and searching. "You look like a queen," he said with a small smile. Alyssa laughed softly, kneeling to pull him into a hug. "And you, my little prince, look very handsome." Noah clung to her for a moment longer than usual, burying his face against her shoulder. She rubbed his back gently, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. "Are you nervous?" she asked, pulling back to look at him. Noah hesitated before nodding. "Yeah? About what, sweetheart?" He bit his lip, glancing toward the door. "I don't know. Just everything." Alyssa felt the weight of his hesitation settle deep in her chest. She should have reassured him, should have told him that everything was going to be fine. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down she wasn't sure if they were true. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of the wedding coordinators peeked in. 5 minutes, Alyssa." She forced a smile, giving Noah's hand a squeeze. "Time to go." Noah nodded, but his grip tightened around her fingers. As they stepped into the hall, she caught sight of Daniel waiting at the end of the grand staircase. He was dressed impeccably, his black tuxedo tailored to perfection, his hair neatly combed back. He was surrounded by a group of his friends, laughing, exchanging firm handshakes and polished smiles. But when his gaze landed on her, something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. Then his eyes moved to Noah. The warmth in his face cooled instantly, replaced by something hard, something cold. "Come on, Noah," Alyssa whispered, gently tugging his hand. She didn't want to give Daniel a reason to scold him before the ceremony even began. Noah walked beside her, his small feet barely making a sound against the polished marble floors. Daniel stepped forward, offering his arm to Alyssa. "You look breathtaking," he murmured. Alyssa smiled, but it felt forced. "Thank you." Noah stood awkwardly at her side, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Daniel's gaze flickered down to him, his jaw tightening. "Noah, stand up straight," he said quietly, his voice sharp. The boy immediately straightened his posture, his shoulders tensing. Alyssa's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to say something to tell Daniel to ease up, but the music began playing in the garden below, signaling the start of the ceremony. It was too late. The wedding was beginning. The ceremony unfolded like a scene from a dream. Guests sat in neat rows, dressed in expensive suits and elegant gowns. The flowers lining the aisle were perfect. their fragrance blending with the fresh outdoor air. A string quartet played softly as Alyssa and Daniel stood before the officiant, hands clasped, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. From the outside, it looked flawless. Inside, Alyssa felt as though she were standing on unstable ground, as though something unseen was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull her under. She glanced at Noah, sitting in the front row. His small legs swung slightly, his polished dress shoes barely touching the ground. He was fidgeting, a nervous habit he had always had, shifting slightly in his seat as the ceremony stretched on. Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. She turned to look at him, startled by the sudden pressure. His jaw was clenched, his eyes momentarily dark with something she couldn't place. Then he smiled, and it was gone. The officiant's voice rang out. "If anyone has any objections, speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence. But inside, Alyssa felt something shift. She brushed the feeling aside, convincing herself that it was just nerves. This was her wedding day. Everything would be fine. The reception was grand, the kind of celebration that belonged in magazines. Laughter and conversation filled the air, the clinking of champagne glasses echoing through the lavish estate. Guests danced beneath glittering chandeliers, their faces flushed with happiness and alcohol. Alyssa moved through the crowd, smiling, thanking people for coming, her dress flowing elegantly around her. Yet no matter how much she tried to lose herself in the joy of the evening, a lingering unease clung to her. Then she saw Noah by the dessert table. He was reaching for a small piece of cake, his fingers barely brushing the plate when Daniel's hand clamped down on his shoulder. Alyssa's heart lurched. She started forward, but before she could reach them, she heard it. A loud, unmistakable slap. The sound cut through the noise of the reception like a blade. The room fell into stunned silence. Noah stumbled back, a red mark blooming across his cheek, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Alyssa froze. Her breath left her in a sharp, strangled gasp. Daniel stood over the boy, his expression tight with fury. "How many times have I told you to behave?" His voice was low, but filled with barely contained rage. Noah's lip trembled. He clutched his hands together, his small body trembling. Alyssa's vision blurred. Everything inside her snapped. The music had stopped. The guests were staring, some in horror, some in awkward discomfort, as though unsure whether they should intervene. She felt heat rise to her face, a mix of fury and disbelief. Daniel had hit her son, here, in front of everyone. Without thinking, she stepped forward, gripping Noah's hand and pulling him close. She turned to Daniel, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You don't deserve to be my husband," she said, her voice strong despite the tears burning in her eyes. "And you sure as hell don't deserve to be his father." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Daniel looked at her as though she had just struck him. "Alyssa." But she was already turning away. She bent down, cupping Noah's face gently, wiping the tears from his cheeks. "Come on, baby," she whispered, and then, with her head held high, she walked out of the wedding. The guests whispered, stunned. Daniel stood frozen, humiliated, watching the woman he thought he had controlled slip right through his fingers. Alyssa didn't care. She had made her choice. She was done pretending. Alyssa didn't stop walking until she was well beyond the estate's grand entrance, the towering iron gates glistening under the glow of the evening lights. The cool night air hit her like a wave, but it did nothing to soothe the burning rage and humiliation coursing through her veins. Noah clung to her hand, his small fingers trembling in her grip. His cheek was still red from the slap, his lower lip quivering as he tried and failed to hold back the tears welling in his eyes. She stopped beneath a large oak tree lining the driveway and knelt before him, her hands gently cupping his tear-streaked face. Her own voice was shaken when she spoke. "Are you okay, baby?" Noah swallowed hard, nodding, but his expression told her otherwise. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I didn't mean to make him mad." Alyssa felt something inside her shatter. Her son, the sweetest, kindest boy she had ever known, was apologizing, as if he had done something wrong, as if Daniel had the right to hurt him. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. "No, sweetheart, you have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. Do you hear me?" Noah nodded against her shoulder, his little body still trembling. Footsteps approached from behind, and Alyssa tensed, her protective instincts surging. She turned sharply, ready to fight if necessary, but the moment she saw who it was, her muscles relaxed. Claire. Her best friend stood there, her elegant dress slightly wrinkled, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she hurried over. Her face was a mix of shock and concern. "Alyssa, are you—" She stopped short when she saw Noah's face, her eyes darkening. "Oh my God." Alyssa let out a shaky breath. "He hit him, Claire. He hit my son." Claire didn't hesitate. She crouched beside them, brushing Noah's curls back gently. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Noah nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It just stings a little." Claire turned to Alyssa, fury flashing in her eyes. "I knew something was off about him. I told you." She caught herself, taking a deep breath before continuing, her voice softer. "Come on, let's get you out of here." Alyssa didn't argue. She lifted Noah into her arms, his small fingers clutching the fabric of her dress as she followed Claire toward the parking lot. Her heart was still pounding, her mind racing through the events of the past few months. How had she been so blind? How had she ignored all the signs? More than anything, how had she allowed this man anywhere near her child? She knew the answer, even if it hurt to admit. She had wanted to believe in the dream, wanted to believe that Daniel was the man he had pretended to be. She had convinced herself that she was doing the right thing, not just for herself, but for Noah. But she had been wrong. So very, very wrong. Claire's car was parked near the entrance. As Alyssa buckled Noah into the back seat, she felt a presence behind her, a heavy, familiar presence. Daniel. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening. He stood a few feet away, his tuxedo still pristine, but his expression was a storm of emotions, shock, frustration, and something else, something colder. "Alyssa, don't do this," he said, his voice low. "You're overreacting." Overreacting. Alyssa saw red. "You hit my child in front of everyone," she hissed, stepping forward. "You put your hands on him, and you expect me to just brush it off?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was a mistake. He was being careless, and I—" "Stop!" Alyssa's voice was ice. "Just stop." Claire stepped beside her, arms crossed. "You should go back inside, Daniel. Whatever excuse you think you have, it's not going to work." Daniel's jaw clenched. "You don't understand, Alyssa. You always coddle him. He needs discipline." The words sent a chill down her spine. She had heard them before. That same dismissive tone, that same belief that her son was somehow a burden, that he needed to be molded into something else, something Daniel deemed acceptable. Alyssa took a slow, deep breath, her voice steady and unwavering. "Noah is not yours to discipline, and he never will be." Daniel's face darkened, but before he could respond, Claire grabbed Alyssa's arm and pulled her toward the car. "Let's go," she muttered. Alyssa didn't look back as she climbed into the passenger seat. Claire started the engine, pulling out of the estate's long driveway, leaving the lavish wedding, the stunned guests, and Daniel's burning gaze behind them. Noah sat quietly in the back, staring out the window. Alyssa reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise you," she said softly, "no one will ever hurt you again." He looked up at her, his eyes wide and trusting. "Really?" Alyssa nodded. "Really?" And for the first time in months, she knew she was telling the truth. The silence in the car stretched long as Claire drove through the dimly lit streets. The grand estate, the lavish wedding, and Daniel's chilling presence were fading in the rearview mirror, but Alyssa felt their weight pressing on her chest, lingering like a shadow that refused to lift. Noah sat curled in the back seat, his small frame barely moving, staring out the window with a distant expression. Alyssa kept stealing glances at him, her stomach twisting at the red mark still visible on his cheek. It was fading, but it was there. Undeniable proof of everything she had tried to ignore. She had failed him. The thought burned. Claire finally broke the silence. "Where do you want me to take you?" Alyssa hesitated. "Home." "You sure?" "Yes." Her voice was firm, though inside she wasn't sure of anything. "I just want to go home." Claire nodded and focused on the road, but her grip on the steering wheel was tight, her knuckles white. She was furious. Alyssa could feel it in the tension radiating from her. Claire had been suspicious of Daniel for months, but she had never pushed too hard, never overstepped. Now, Alyssa could see in her eyes that she wished she had. Alyssa did too. When they pulled up to the small but cozy apartment that she and Noah had called home for years, Alyssa exhaled shakily. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't an estate dripping with luxury, but it was theirs. It was safe. Claire parked and turned to her. "Do you want me to stay?" Alyssa shook her head. "No, you've done enough, thank you." Claire hesitated. "Are you going to be okay?" Alyssa glanced at Noah, who was already unbuckling his seatbelt, rubbing his tired eyes. "I have to be." Claire didn't argue. She nodded, her eyes softening. "Call me if you need anything, and I mean anything." "I will," Alyssa promised. She helped Noah out of the car, carrying him up the stairs, even though he insisted he could walk. She just needed to hold him. She needed to feel his warmth against her, to reassure herself that he was real, that he was safe. Once inside, she locked the door behind them, double-checking it, even though she had never done that before. She set Noah down on the couch, crouching in front of him. "You hungry, baby?" Noah shook his head. "Tired?" A small nod. Alyssa ran her fingers gently through his curls. "Let's get you to bed." She helped him change into his pajamas, pulling the blankets up to his chin. She expected him to fall asleep immediately, exhausted from the night's events, but instead he looked up at her with those wide brown eyes, filled with something too heavy for a child to carry. "Mom?" he whispered. "Yeah, baby?" "Is Daniel going to come here?" Alyssa felt her breath hitch. "No," she said firmly, "I promise. He's never coming near you again." Noah stared at her, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. When he found none, he finally relaxed, his body sinking into the mattress. Alyssa stayed with him until his breathing evened out. Only then did she let herself collapse into the chair in the corner of the room, pressing her palms against her face. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent too much time ignoring her instincts, letting herself believe in something that was never real. That ended tonight. The next morning, Alyssa woke up with a plan. She had spent the night replaying everything over and over in her head, the way Daniel had spoken about Noah, the coldness in his eyes, the way he had hit her son without hesitation. He wouldn't stop just because she had walked away. She needed to make sure he couldn't come back. After making Noah breakfast, pancakes, his favorite, though he barely touched them, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't thought she would ever need: a law firm. The receptionist transferred her call, and within minutes she was speaking to a lawyer, a woman named Anna Rodriguez. Alyssa told her everything. The slow buildup of Daniel's hostility toward Noah, the controlling behavior, the slap, the way Daniel had tried to justify it, to make it seem like discipline instead of what it truly was: abuse. Anna listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions in a calm, reassuring tone. "You have a strong case," Anna finally said. "Since Daniel never legally adopted Noah, he has no parental rights over him. We can file a restraining order to ensure that he can't contact either of you. If he violates it, he could face legal consequences." Alyssa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "How soon can we do that?" "Today, if you're ready." "I am." She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for Noah. Later that day, Alyssa sat in Anna's office signing papers that would officially sever any legal ties between her and Daniel. Claire sat beside her for support, and Noah sat on a chair in the corner, flipping through a picture book, oblivious to the legal battle his mother was waging on his behalf. When it was done, Anna looked up at her. "We'll get this processed as quickly as possible. In the meantime, if Daniel tries to contact you, document everything. If he shows up, call the police. You're not alone in this, Alyssa." She nodded. "Thank you." As they left the office, Claire glanced at her. "How do you feel?" Alyssa inhaled deeply, feeling the weight that had been sitting on her chest for months finally begin to lift. "Free," she said, and for the first time in a long, long time, she truly meant it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more compelling stories, and feel free to share this video with your friends. See you in the next one. The